Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Interesting story to the New York Times. Safe deposit boxes aren't safe, which seems ironic because that's what they're called, safe deposit boxes. But it turns out that they're not governed the same way you might think they'd be governed with respect to them being at banks and whatnot. So there are an estimated 25 million safe deposit boxes in America and few protections for customers. No federal laws govern the boxes. No rules require banks to compensate customers if their property is stolen or destroyed while in the box. So the New York Times tells a story of a man named Philip Panez who moved to New Jersey from Colorado and stashed a collection of rare watches in a safe deposit box at a local bank. And the bank changed hands several times, but the vault stayed there, just the name on the outside changed. So in 1983, he signed a one-page lease with the first bank, and it changed names several times. And over the years, he put a bunch of watches, very, very valuable watches, in the safe deposit box. And I know what some of you are thinking. How do we know he did that? Well, it turns out he's actually one of the world's renowned experts in watches, and his collection was actually very, very well known. So in 2014, so obviously quite a few years later, he went in and his box was empty. And he rightfully freaked out. What happened to my stuff? And so he then complained to the bank, and they figured out what happened. The bank had apparently tried to evict another customer for not keeping up with payments, and bank employees had accidentally removed his box instead. They drilled his box open because the box had one of those double key safety systems. They drilled the box open, shipped its contents to a storage facility in North Carolina, and then later on, they said, oh, we've got your stuff, and they sent it back, but a bunch of the stuff was missing. And what was missing actually amounted to about $10 million worth of stuff. Now, I know what you're thinking. How do we know any of this is true? Turns out this is pretty well documented. But one of the interesting things is that most people think that safe deposit boxes are just safe. I mean, aren't they? I mean, there's a vault, and there's these walls of boxes, and it takes two keys to get into it. I've got one, and they've got one. And of course, the movies are replete with examples of safe deposit boxes being targets of criminals. But I was going to tell you, I read a fascinating book a few years ago called Frick Frack. And I actually started going through it. I'm going to do a book report on this for you guys one of these days. It's one of my favorite books because a guy named Albert Spaghiari wrote it. And he's the man who masterminded the Great Riviera Bank robbery. And that's the no guns, no hate, no violence robbery, which you may have heard about if you're my age. And that was, long story short, he figured out that there was a bank in France that had a safe deposit box used by a lot of rich people that didn't have an alarm system because it was so secure it didn't need one until he heard about it. And him and a bunch of guys went through the sewers of France and got behind the wall on the other side of the safe deposit boxes and busted in on one long holiday weekend. They knocked over the safe deposit boxes on the inside once they were inside. They welded the doors shut from the inside and then spent the weekend emptying out boxes and hauling all the stuff out. And it's a fascinating story. And he got away with it because when they eventually got arrested, and he was arrested, he miraculously escaped and fled to South America where he wrote the book. And the authorities actually admit, yeah, he got away. So it's one of these bizarre stories. I'm not saying I want to, emulate him or make him out to be a hero, but as far as stories go, it's a true story, and it's actually very, very interesting. So again, that's Frick Frack, the Great Riviera Bank Robbery. I don't even know if it's still in print or not, but I got this used copy someplace. But so we often talk about safe deposit boxes, and you often think that they're secure, but here's the problem. They're not governed by federal law. They're not insured by FDIC. What you put in there is basically you trusting the box is safe. So banks themselves are actually getting out of the business. The president of the Safe Deposit Box Insurance Coverage, a guy named Jerry Plouard, said all of the major national banks would prefer to be out of the safe deposit box business. They view it as a legacy service that's not strategic to anything they do, and they've stopped putting any real focus or resources into it. He estimates that about half of the safe deposit boxes in the country are empty, and the number being used has been steadily declining. In Maryland, a large bank closed several branches and lost track of hundreds of safe deposit boxes, according to a lawsuit, followed by a customer who said he lost gold and gems valued at $500,000. In Florida, a customer accused another bank of losing her box and all its contents. She sued, and a federal judge ruled that she had waited too long to file her claim and decided in the bank's favor. In California, a customer said a bank accidentally re-rented her box with all of her stuff in it, and someone else just took it. So when these cases go to court, the banks often have the upper hand because, number one, the contract you sign will quite often say, oh, you agree to limit the liability to 10 times the rental value. Meaning if you spend $1,000 to rent the box, the most we'll ever owe you is $10,000. And that's been upheld by courts before. Likewise, in a situation where somebody broke into this guy, the watch collector's box, and they did it intentionally, drilled it out, and just negligently got into the wrong box, it's going to be a little better of a case in terms of liability. But again, that's the problem. So he wound up filing a lawsuit, and his attorneys, or excuse me, the attorney for the bank said there's no question that Wells Fargo drilled the box and took the contents out, put it in storage, and then returned it. The underlying dispute is, was everything returned or not? And the bank employees admit that they opened his box and they inventoried the items, 92 watches. And then when they returned the items to him, there were only 85 watches. No question, 7 watches are missing, okay? So if 7 watches are missing, it's not a debate about whether or not all the watches were returned. They weren't. It's just a question of what were those 7 watches worth. So the man whose watches were missing said, my impression about safe deposit boxes was that it was like you were putting things in Fort Knox. And obviously that's not the case. So the bank also, when they returned a bunch of watches to him, included 5 watches that weren't his. And he's like, these aren't even my watches. So the question then becomes, whose were they? Did they take them from another customer? New Jersey law requires the bank to bring an independent notary when it opens and empties a safe deposit box, and then have the notary vouch for what's been put into a sealed package, which the notary then signs. So here's the problem. The disappearance of the coins and watches suggests that the bank, which in recent years has also had other problems, didn't follow that law. And that is where they might get in trouble. The bank said they're reviewing the facts and circumstances of the case, said their spokesman, but we cannot comment further due to pending litigation. And of course, the watchman has hired lawyers. One of them said he pressed the bank to find the missing items, but it couldn't. He asked for financial settlement. The bank said no. So he filed a lawsuit. And meanwhile, there have been other cases where people have managed to push these things into arbitration as opposed to court. But the lawsuit with the guy and the watches, nowhere near resolution. It's already cost the man tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. But the problem is that the watches are actually worth pursuing. One of the watches that vanished was a 19th century pocket watch whose face was dotted with pearls and rubies and concealed a pop-up bird slightly larger than a thumbnail that twittered and sang. It's a singing bird watch. Rarely comes to market, and one of the last that was sold at auction, which happened literally 20 years ago, sold for $772,000 to Patek Philippe Museum in Geneva. So that one watch alone would make all of this worthwhile. The watchman, by the way, has spent a decade working at Sotheby's, and he also consults for Christie's. He is their horological expert, which is the scientific name for a watch expert. Horology is the study of watches. I know it sounds like something else. And he had hoped, before it disappeared, that his singing bird watch would one day be the centerpiece of an auction of his own collection. But he said, it's gone now. So who knows what's going to happen with respect to whether he can ever recover it or recover the equivalent of it in cash. So that's the problem with safe deposit boxes. Number one, they're not terribly safe. And number two, they do not offer you the same protection that the bank does with respect to the money. So if you had a pile of cash and you put it in a bank account and deposited it, it's insured by the FDIC. You take the same cash, put it in a safe deposit box, and it disappears, there might not be any remedy, or the remedy might be that you get some fraction of it back because there's a clause in the contract that says here's what you get. And I understand what you're going to think next. You're saying, well, Steve, but some people do the cash things. They don't want the IRS to know about it. Of course. And of course, that's the byproduct of this. Okay, so that's the problem with safe deposit boxes. Questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.